Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Rick Sanchez, the host from the Sanchez Effect on RT. So, welcome to the program. You have a unique and very rare insider view of the media in both the West as well as Russia, as you have worked for networks such as CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and now, of course, you are with RT. This seems like a very interesting and unique experience these days, given that much of the conflict between the West and Russia now seem to fall within the realm of almost a battle for narratives. And
Mhm.
in this, it's quite unfortunate because without any mutual understanding, we do have some profound problem. But you have a nice insight into, I guess, both camps. So I wanted to pick your brain a bit on these issues. I thought perhaps a good place to start would be, how do you interpret or assess the different ways the Western media and the Russian media frame the Ukraine war?
Well, I think first we have to start with what is the US media and now what is the media that has developed here in what used to be the closed system of the Soviet Union, which has now become a much more expressive opportunity for people in this country to say what they think, and as well as for members of the media, which is really surprising for a guy like me. I grew up in a communist country. I was born in Cuba. And I was always taught to fear the Soviets and their communist system with their apparatchiks. And if you even hinted at something that would upset somebody in the KGB, you would end up, in Siberia or something like that. And that's the way a lot of people in the United States still think. Unfortunately, I, as you just mentioned, had the advantage of having worked in the media in the United States. And I worked at CNN and Fox and NBC, and I can tell you what it's like to work there. And I'll just give you a snippet of an example so you can better understand how the world has actually flipped. It's completely different. So I was the guy who had a big show on CNN. It was quite popular. I always tried to buck the system, but it's hard to buck the system, and I'll explain to you why. So they have somebody in Washington, for example, who is their Pentagon correspondent. Then they have another person who's their State Department correspondent. And at any time in the day when the Pentagon or the State Department decides that it wants to interrupt the news because they have something they want to say to the American people, they literally like ring a bell, and the State Department correspondent then stands in front of the camera. They feed him or her a line, and they will say, "We have just uncovered that there's new documents proving that such and such is a bad person. Vladimir Putin, Xi, Modi, make up whoever it is you want." And then they'll come on a half hour later and say something else, usually glowing about one of our allies, for example. So it becomes this predictable pattern where I start seeing these people who are good people. They're my correspondents on my show, and I got to know them. Oftentimes, I've talked to them before and after the show. But their job in the United States, right? You're watching CNN or you're watching the BBC or you're watching Fox News. They hire people whose job it is to dictate the palaver that is coming out of the State Department or the Pentagon without questioning it. And then my problem was I would question it, Glenn. I often would say to the correspondent, but wait, that doesn't add up. And suddenly I'd hear my producer say, "Oh, we're getting a wrap. We got to go." And the more I did this, when I was there when we were getting ready to go to war in Iraq, when we were in Afghanistan, and a lot of things were happening, and I was going, "This doesn't make sense." And I felt like I wasn't allowed to control the narrative of my show, which is the supreme thing that a journalist has to be able to do. People talk in journalism all the time about what is, what is biased news, or there's no such thing as non-biased news because we all bring our biases with us, including me, by the way. But what you can do is you can be fair, right? You can try to be fair to the story and to the people that you're talking about. And I tried oftentimes to do that, and I ended up on, on my arse, as they like to say. I got fired every time I push back on this narrative. So that's essentially the way it works. They hire people to basically manifest the dictate that's coming out of these places. And what does that remind you of? Um, and what does it remind you of when people who speak against that, like myself, end up getting fired, for example? Vladimir Putin last night, because we happen to have been celebrating here in Moscow 20 years of free speech as a broadcast entity that we all know as RT, which is airing my shows now, as you mentioned. And the the interesting thing that Mr. Putin came out and, he being the president of the country came out and said a few nice words. And he harkened back to his time as a KGB agent, which he did when you and I were with a meeting in Sochi, by the way, which I found quite interesting. And he said, the US media has become, in many ways, what we used to do back during the Soviet era. And then he said they block, they stop, they interfere. He says, when we used to do he didn't say KGB, he said, Intel or whatever, but we all knew what he was talking about. He said, at least back then, we tried to work with people and delicately tried to maybe convert them or get them to maybe see a different point of view. In this case, it's very, very different. Um, and here's here's the leader of what you and I grew up with as the Soviet Union, talking about the importance of truth and free speech. And at one point, by the way, and this has to do with the Tomahawk incident that you and I know is going on in the world right now, he also said, Russia has the best intercontinental weapon in the world today, and it's called truth. I was like, well, if nothing else, you have to give him credit, or whoever wrote that for him, because that's a hell of a good line, and especially a timely one as well.
Yeah, this it is a strange to see how things have flipped. I remember also back in 2017 in Davos, you had the was it Trump then who was making the argument that we need more protection, and then you had the Chinese delegation arguing for the virtues of free trade, and I was thinking it's the worst communist party there is. And then next you go, now of course, yeah, in Moscow, capital of former Soviet Union, arguing for the need for free speech. Now, obviously, you can say that there's problems in Russia as well, but it does touch upon an interesting point, that is what has been falling apart in the West, and especially I see from Europe, the accountability is quite strange. I mean, you were there in the United States during the Russiagate era. We had these headlines for years and years, which were fake. There's been no accountability. There was no accountability for the Biden laptop. There was no accountability for the so-called bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
We saw now this von der Leyen flight, which was scrambled or by Russians, was fake. There's no accountability, and I guess for me, one of the big things was Nord Stream, because we were up in arms. We were gonna escalate in Ukraine. We were talking about possible Article 5 in NATO. This was essentially an attack by Russia. It's like Pearl Harbor. We were, up in arms. And then once we found out, oh, it wasn't the Russians after all, this wasn't the Russian playbook, as we were told, to blow up Iran pipelines, it disappeared. Nobody wants to talk about it. And whenever you have some notes coming out from some EU diplomats, it's, well, don't ask questions if you don't want to know the answer. So this is the logic. And the journalists, they all seem to fall in line, which is quite extraordinary. I was wondering, how do you assess what is happening across Europe? Because at least during the Cold War, we had the confidence to know the arguments of the Russians. These days, I mean, even if I present cold hard facts which can't be denied, I would get feedbacks like, well, that's what Putin wants you to think, or, oh, this is Kremlin talking point. So
Yeah.
we make it go away by calling it pro-Russian, whatever that might mean. They don't want to unpack this concept, but call it pro-Russian, and it has to go away. It has to be censored. I mean, it's quite. How do you end up here? Is, I guess, what I'm asking.
Well, first of all, I'm an American journalist, and I decided after Joe Biden and his administration made it illegal for me to practice journalism in the United States. That's literally what they did. They passed a law saying no one who has any kind of ties to Russia is allowed to practice journalism in the United States with under penalty of imprisonment and fines. Yes, by the way, in case you're wondering and you're listening to us at home, the United States of America decided to make journalism illegal for some people under the Biden administration. And that's when and I enjoyed doing my show, and I've always had complete dominion of my narrative in my show. Glenn will tell you because he's probably familiar with it, as will any of the guests who've been on my show. I have no questions written down. Nothing is sent to me. I write my own script. I say what I want to say. I prepare what I want to say. And this is something that I wasn't able to do in the United States, but I'm able to do it, here. And I think that's, that's an important part of this story and and it's allowed me to do things that I never thought I would be able to do because you see, in the United States, we don't cover the other side. We don't cover, like, for example, Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi or Mr. Modi will hold a news conference and say some interesting things, or maybe not so much interesting things, but at least it's covered. And if he does say something interesting, if you're a respectable news operation, you share it with your people. Today, the president of Russia said, blah, blah, blah. Nothing, zero in the United States. Mr. Putin could give the most profound, perfect speech in the world, or for that matter, the worst, most dangerous speech in the world, they won't cover it. They don't even tell you what's happening. Every once in a while, they'll take a little snippet if they think they can make a 24-hour news cycle story out of it where, they can get it to go viral or something because, he scratched his nose and gave the sign of the devil or something. So it's just, it's ludicrous. And then while I've been here and I've had the opportunity to sit down with the Minister of Finance and the Foreign Affairs ministers and other people who I now have access to, just as I did when I went to cover the Shanghai Cooperative Summit, for example, with Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi. I feel like I'm in a unique position as an American journalist, a Western journalist, to avail myself of at least the opportunity to see who are these people? What are they saying it? What are they saying? Why are they saying it? How are they saying it? I find that the Russians, for example, to be very judicious and almost over officious, boring almost to the point where they'll give just yesterday, the head of the Russian security came out and said, we now have evidence that MI6 was planning to blow up Turk Stream, another pipeline, that belongs to Russia. And we have the goods. And we also now have evidence that they were involved in that spiderweb operation that blew up many of the Russia's fleet of planes, some of which were actually even used in for future nuclear operations. And he came out and gave this declaration, and he could not have been more boring. He just went like, like this, Glenn, and he read, we have found out that on such and such a date, such and such a person went to this place, they did this, they did that. No adjectives, no adverbs, no chest thumping, just in a boring way. He just sat there and read all the information about what they had uncovered that MI6 had done inside of Russia, which is fascinating when you consider that I have sources, and I'm sure so do you, who have told me that MI6 was also responsible for the Crimea Bridge, for the train derailment that happens 6.5 months ago, for some of the operations against Russian generals inside of Moscow when they were home with their families. This is very serious stuff, the kind of thing that a country with less restraint would literally attack the other country for. And in fact, most Western countries have and would do something like that, and they would call it a terrorism operation. Well, this was just announced 48 hours ago. Where is it? Where's the New York Times with a headline that's saying the Brits attacked inside of Russia and blew up its nuclear fleet? Under any other circumstances, it would be an amazing story, but yet where's that story in The Guardian and the BBC and in all of these places? It doesn't exist. And once again, it goes back to the point we started the conversation with. I know we veered off of Ukraine a little bit, and we can get to that, but the essence of what makes truth is the ability to understand and hear things that you would not normally be able to hear just as a common person who's got a job 9 to 5, right? You get home, you turn on the news or you read your newspaper, and you want to depend that those people are telling you what's important to you, not just picking the stuff that they think they want to give you based on how they want to come across well or they want their friends to come across well. No, just tell the damn truth and let it lie where let things lie where they may. That's the problem. And I have found, yes, back to my point that I was trying to make. I have found that because I'm in a unique position, I see that sure, there's stuff here that happens too, but that you're gonna get biases from government officials, and you're gonna have stuff that you're gonna have to question, and you're gonna have to stuff that you're gonna have to go, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. But at least you're allowed to do that, and you're allowed to present information. I talk about the US government and I talk about the British government and I talk about the German and French governments here. But in the United States, they don't talk about the Indian government or the Xi government or the Putin government. They just don't even talk about it at all. If you want to see anything about Vladimir Putin, you have to see him on comedy shows where they make fun of him.
Yeah, well, this is quite explosive news, though, when it comes out of the head of Russian security or the FSB that they now have evidence that it's the British who's behind all these different terrorist attacks across Russia. But also, as you said, the most important one, that the British were directly behind the attack on Russia's nuclear deterrent. I mean, if you attack the nuclear deterrent of the world's largest nuclear power, you're now gambling with the future of the whole world. And it's not news. I mean, we don't have to accept whatever the Russian authorities say as evidence, but let's address the argument. This is what they accused. Where's the evidence? Do we agree with it? What is the counter response from the British authorities? But again, pretending as
Bingo.
if this was never said. I mean, it's quite shocking. It often feels that a lot of the censorship and as well as the cancellations go back to the idea that if you present the Russian perspective, then you're legitimizing or taking their side. But it's so, well, first of all, you need to know what the opposing side is arguing if you want to mitigate the conflicts, but also on a wider frame. I mean, if we take a step back and move away from all this war propaganda that the Russians want to restore the Soviet Union, they might march on Paris, so all this nonsense. If abandon this, take a step back. What is it? It's not about taking one side or the other. It's the whole idea that this whole war, this conflict, it seems quite unnecessary. I mean, it was very difficult to live next to the Soviet Union because of the ideological differences. But with Russia, how different are they today? I mean, if if Putin isn't Hitler trying to invade all of Europe, how difficult would it be to harmonize our strategic interests and visions for how Europe should be organized? I mean, we could, the idea that we're now prepared to go attack a nuclear deterrent instead of looking at diplomacy or how to harmonize our interests, it shows how far the propaganda's gone and how much fear there is that we might be risk seeing taking the side of the Russians. It's
And it goes against the facts. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you go back from 1991 to the present, the Russians, think what you may about them, hate them for whatever they did during the Soviet era, don't like Putin, whatever. The Russians have not done anything since 1990s that has been threatening to the West. In fact, anybody from, Professor Jeffrey Sachs to John Mearsheimer to any real student of this Russo-American and Anglo relationship will show you, will document, and you can even look at it yourself with any little basic Google search, have bent over backwards to cajole the West. They have bent over backwards. We want to be like you. We want to follow you. We want to join you. We want to be a part of NATO. Please let us in. What does it take? How much does it cost? Where do we buy a ticket? Done everything possible to try and cajole the West, and the West has consistently kick them in the teeth every single time. And I can't, until finally it got to Ukraine, and that's where the red line was drawn. And, President Putin finally said, that's it. I mean, come on. How stupid do you think we are? We keep coming to you guys, offering our hand, and you keep spitting on it. And we're tired of you spitting on our hand, and we're just not going to take this anymore. And this is really, that provocation is what started this whole thing. And it has so little to do with Ukraine in so many ways, and so much more to do with the West. This is why this meeting in Hungary between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin is so important, because Mr. Trump, I trust, and my sources are telling me the Americans are almost there, have to realize what I just said and the profundity of it. This is not about Russia versus Ukraine. This is about Russia versus the United States of America, because the, that's who we're really talking about when we look at these two sides who are actually in conflict or at war. Beyond even the tomahawk conversation, which is obviously crazy, because I think the Russian perspective is, look, no, you give them tomahawks, that's fine. It's not going to change the course of the war, but it will change the course of relations between the United States and Russia. That might be a red line for us. That tells us what you think of us. Because if you allow tomahawks with a range of 1,000 to 1,500 miles to be used out of Ukraine, that means you're willing to hit Moscow. That means you're willing to hit St. Petersburg and Kazan and other, or Sochi and other perhaps Russian cities, because it falls within that range. And that is a bridge too far. But going back to my more important point is, it really behooves Mr. Trump, and I think we're close, and I think this might happen. And I think, thank God, that Hungary is a much better place for this conversation than Alaska, where U.S. reporters who, as you and I kidded when we were last together, think that Multipolarity is a Steven Spielberg movie that's coming out. They're so dumb and so rigid in the West. All they did in Alaska was question Mr. Putin's right to be on American soil. He's the president of Russia. Like, he's not the president of some tiny country somewhere. But what I think Mr. Trump has to do is, he has to, at some point, get to the place where he lets his advisors and the world understand, my goal here is not Ukraine. Ukraine is a nice part of this, and this is going to be part of the outflow of this conversation. What I need to do as the president of the United States, what we need to do as a country, is reestablish relationship with Russia. So either as of this day or within the next couple of months, I will start lifting the sanctions against Russia. And by doing that, by establishing that relationship with Russia, that's what you're basically saying to the world, that this is how I'm going to end Ukraine. You can't go in there and say that we're going to end this war and we're mediators sitting in the background or sitting on the fence looking at these two sides who are warring. No, you're warring. You're warring with them. And as long as you continue to punish Russia and punish Russia and punish Russia, you're a part of the Ukraine battle against Russia. So you need to show some kind of sign that you're willing to go back on some of those things. And as soon as you establish a relationship, it doesn't have to be sex in bed every day like you were having with Bibi Netanyahu and the Israelis, but at least some kind of relationship that shows we're willing to do rapprochement with Russia. And the moment that signal is sent, I think it will begin to dissipate the situation in Ukraine. And that has to happen. And the Russians want that, because the Russians are much more interested in rapprochement with Washington than they are with meeting Mr. Zelensky's demands for 1 mile of land here, 1 mile of land there, or whatever other ridiculous or preposterous position he takes, which is always, by the way, ignoring anything the Russians even have brought to the table on this. I think that's the most important part of this. And the only reason I'm a little confident, or not a little bit confident, but confident, is because my sources tell me that this is what the Trump administration now wants to do. Post Gaza, this is what they're going to be hell bent on. This is going to be their bone, and they're going to be the dog, right? Um, and Trump will be like a dog with a bone to get this done. And I think they understand that it's important to do the first part before you get to the latter. And I do think Hungary is a better venue than, and I think Orban sets the table well for this discussion. And it's a really neutral, friendly country. Alaska wasn't. Alaska was a unfriendly country. I know it's not a country, but you get the point. It was an unfriendly place for these two people to meet.
Yeah, I'm well firmly convinced that, as you suggest, we need to reduce or tame the war propaganda at home if it's going to be possible to actually make peace. Because I was speaking not that long ago with Jack Matlock, who was, of course, the ambassador to Reagan to the Soviet Union, and he was saying something similar, that when him and Reagan wanted to negotiate an end to the Cold War, one of the biggest obstacles was Washington, because the hatred of the Soviets, and including Russians, was so fierce that that any peace negotiation would be seen as appeasement almost. So yeah, like the same language we have today. So he was making the point, they first have to sell negotiation to the war hawks at home before they were able to sit down with Mr. Gorbachev and negotiate an end to this. But this is so. I think the narratives and war propaganda home is a huge obstacle to preventing the nuclear exchange.
And it's in the psyche of the president. And you know how I know it's in the psyche of the president? And you know as well. And everybody who watched his news conference with Putin in Alaska knows. Do you remember, Glenn, when Putin said to Trump, maybe Mr. President, next time we'll do this in Moscow. And suddenly you saw this almost President Trump's face almost kind of changed colors. And then he looked around almost scared like and mysterious, and he goes, well, I don't know. I might get in trouble for that. I'm like, you're the president of the United States. You just signaled to the world that you might get in trouble, like you're some school kid and your teacher might, slap your hand for thinking bad thoughts or something. You could see the what you just talked about, right? Was in his psyche. It was as an American and a guy who grew up in the Cold War. I mean, he's long in the tooth, obviously. As soon as the president invited him to Moscow, he got like scared. Rather than saying, well, sure, you've come to my country. Now maybe I will come to your country and we'll see if we can figure this out. That's what a man says. That's what a leader says. That's what a friend says, or somebody who at least is decent enough to be talking to an enemy who's offering him an olive branch. Instead, he freaked out. He looked like he had just seen a ghost or something. And that moment was so important, I thought. I remember it was one of those things as a journalist I started writing down and then underlining, like, damn, that said volumes more than any speech could have said to me anyway.
I want to ask you about one of the key narratives, which you already alluded to, which is the idea that we kind of have to, if we want to solve this war, we do have to recognize, as you said, that it's primarily between the United States and Russia, fought, of course, in Ukraine as a proxy. Um, but we already had people like Marco Rubio, Boris Johnson, Leon Panetta openly say, yeah, this is a proxy war. I know you know Marco Rubio, and then even Donald Trump has at times, well, more than once, referred to the war as having been provoked by NATO expansion. So we all know that this is a proxy war. Yet the same people who have defined this as a proxy war only sees the solution as being a Russia-Ukraine deal. And this is where, on one hand, Trump said, well, this war was Biden's war, but also he's a mediator to end the Russia-Ukraine war. But at some point, one has to to take oneself not standing on the outside being this mediator, but actually address the issues between the US and Russia. Because I saw Trump now, he tweeted out, or Truth Social, however we should refer to it, he said, I just want peace, time to end this. Both Russia and Ukraine should claim victory. And again, he's the mediator. But no reference to, okay, we're prepared to take NATO expansion off the table, the key foundation for the whole war. So we established that this is a proxy war. How come we ended up with this narrative embraced by the political media elites that the only solution can be a Russia-Ukraine deal? Because the putting an end to NATO expansion, that doesn't have to be put on the shoulders of the Ukrainians. That would be very hard for Mr. Zelensky to accept, given that he has some problems in his own government. But this is within the US control. I mean, a lot of the things we're discussing here is an issue which the US and Russia could agree between themselves. How did we end up with this full consensus that the role of Trump is simply to make the Russians and Ukrainians come to an agreement? Because we already accepted. I mean, as I said, Marco Rubio, Boris Johnson, Leo Panetta, Trump, they all recognize this is a Trump war. No, sorry, that this is a proxy war.
Yeah.
So how do you explain this?
It's not just a proxy war. Here's the golden goose that was given to Trump. It's not a proxy war. It's an Obama-Biden war. So this thing was put on a silver platter for Mr. Trump. All he has to do is continue saying where he started this conversation a long time ago, which was, this is not my war. This would not have happened under my administration. I did not do this. And the people who did this were foolish, and they allowed themselves to be pulled by the nose by some bad people who were simply trying to make money. They provoked Russia into this situation, thereby creating this war. And I'm going to undo this, right? So you have the opportunity to use what is a very sound argument to the American people from your bully pulpit. And at one point, he was there. And everybody thought, oh, I see where this is going. Going to blame it on Biden, blame it on Obama, rightfully so. And he's going to pull away. But then something happened. And you're right. I mean, I know Marco and have covered him most of my life. And we grew up in Miami as two Cuban Americans. And Marco has always been staunchly on the side of neocons and still is on some things, like obviously with the case of his friend Miriam Adelson and Bibi Netanyahu. But when it comes to Russia, I watched Marco transition, and his language has very much changed. And he's challenging the Europeans and stating things like you just said that he would state. So you would think if Marco were saying that, and he speaks for the neocons and speaks for the people who make money off of wars, the military-industrial types of weapons makers, et cetera, you would think then that this thing could really shift in that direction. But somewhere along the line, and I'm not sure when or how, those powers, the administrative state that exists inside of my country, the United States of America, that we now only know too well, somehow was able to undo that narrative and get back on top of Mr. Trump's assignment in Ukraine. And I'm not sure how they did it, or I'm not sure how they got to him. I mean, you talk to McGregor and you talk to some of these people who are more insiders than I am, but they definitely were able to scare Trump into buying back in partially or wholly into that narrative that it's part of his mission as a U.S. president to somehow defeat Russia and change Russia's government and remove Vladimir Putin for some reason. Not that he's ever expressed that the way Biden did. Trump has never said those words, so I don't want to put words in the man's mouth. I take him at his word that deep down he really wants to do this, but he's not doing it with the same kind of furor and the same kind of palaver and the same kind of language that he was using at the outset, which worries me. My sources tell me that now that Gaza is finished, Trump will go back into that mode. And that's one of the things that you and I and others who follow this will see what happens when they meet in Budapest. I'm hopeful that that's that Mr. Trump will regain that ground that he once established and then somehow lost, as you just well articulated.
Yeah, because the language recently has been we need more missiles, more escalation in order to force Putin to the negotiation table. But I thought he was already at the negotiation table. Again, the meeting again in Budapest, and you don't have um, threaten the Russians into negotiating. They said all along that they never closed the door. That it's the Europeans who haven't wanted to pick up a phone and called Moscow now for the past 3.5 years. So it is the language is perplexing to me. I mean, if what they mean is we want Putin to accept a deal, come closer, what I still miss from the media, though, what exactly do they expect from Russia? Because do they expect them to move the red line that they demand the political settlement, that is an end to NATO expansion? Yeah, I don't. They're so. It feels like they're only communicating in these very empty narratives, and yeah, we don't really get any information beyond the slogans. That is, we have to force Russia to negotiation table. Well, why? Well, they are there. Well, what exactly is it that we demand? What are our red lines versus theirs? Where can we move? There, I don't see any real discussion around this. It's quite frustrating.
Well, there are some new developments that have recently happened that play to Mr. Putin's favor going into these negotiations. One of them is the $1.3 million that Boris Johnson got, as reported by The Guardian in a very well written and very well documented uh, article, to basically make sure that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government did not sign a peace deal with Russia in April of 2022. That's huge. That basically is like the goods. It's like the Russians walk into the negotiation saying, we were willing to stop. And a Western leader was flown into our country, paid a bribe to make sure the war continued, so his client, who paid him, according to the report, could make money by selling drones to the Ukrainians. That's an astounding report that should be hammered away. If I was negotiating, I would hammer away at that. I would also present this new information about what MI6 did. I would also then say, quite plainly, right? We're winning. We're winning. We are way beyond even our own expectations. And we're doing it in such a way so that we're gaining ground as we go. We're willing to stop right here and now and draw the line where it is. But if we can't have something other than just the word ceasefire, which to us means nothing, it means the losing side gets a timeout in the fourth quarter when the winning side is up by 25 points. Why am I going to let you stop and get your players a rest, etc., or bring in new players perhaps? No, we either come up with an agreement that gives us something, or we continue. And if we continue, it's beyond Zaporizhia, and it's beyond the Donbass, and it's beyond Crimea. We're now looking at maybe Odessa. So it's to your advantage to negotiate something that is important to us. And the thing we really want the most is not even about Ukraine. It's about us being accepted as a nation, as a member of the community of nations. We would like for some of these castigatory measures that have been taken against us to be removed and to treat us with the respect that we think we're due. And if you can do that, this thing could be over tomorrow. And that's the argument. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but looking at it from here, I think that's all that the Russians need to do. And I think they're in a good position to do it. And I think the Americans, my government, I think is close to understanding that and maybe trying to make that happen, Glenn.
I guess if you want to see how a conflict develops, it can often be good to see how the media narrative changes because, for more than 3 years, these narratives were always going that, it's unprovoked war. The Ukrainians are winning, Russians are taking many more casualties. All the narratives, even how blatantly obvious false they were, all had the same objective, just to keep public support for continuing the war. What you expect, though, is when everything starts to go south, that you have to find some indicators in the media that now the narrative is shifting. So when people like Angela Merkel goes out in the media and says, well, it's Poland and Baltic states really have to take some blame for this war. They're the one who blocked the diplomacy with the Russians in 2021. I mean, that's what the Russians said. That's what we denied. And now, so you see some shifts in the narrative. So that gives some hope that there are some political forces preparing to put an end to this horrible war, though.
The only reason I think they're backing away from that narrative, by the way, if you're referring to, the BBCs and the CNNs of the world who are now being forced to present the truth, because it is the truth that the Russians are, in fact, moving into territories, not losing territories, and they're doing it very judiciously. You notice what they do. They flank around most of the cities. Every city, including the area of Pokros, which they decided not to just take on head on, they're going around it, and in many ways to protect the people of those cities. So, in terms of avoiding civilian casualties, of all the wars that I've seen in recent memory, including Afghanistan and Iraq and certainly Gaza, if we want to call that a war, this is the one war where the rate of civilian casualties vis-a-vis uh, combatant casualties is completely upside down. I mean, the latest that I checked is maybe somewhere between 13 and 15,000 civilians that have died in this war, which is horrible. One is too many, obviously, but it's a relatively small number compared to what we believe happened in Iraq, which is over 500,000, according to some estimates, and what we know has just taken place in Gaza, for example. So you could actually make the argument that the Russians are moving forward very diligently, and they're doing so trying to minimize the deaths of civilians. That's an interesting story, and which can be documented by military analysts who actually look at the information on the ground. But for some reason, they decide not to report that. But they are finally at least reporting that the Russians are advancing and that the Ukrainian military is in really kind of in a bad position. But the only reason they're doing that is because anything else would be laughable. If they didn't report that, it would just be like they completely lose their credibility because now they're done. I remember Tucker told me when he and I were talking, and he and I were chatting yesterday about some things, but he told me that he was fired from Fox News when he started questioning the fact that Ukraine was, in fact, not winning the war. And by inviting McGregor on, and, and he says to me, because we were sharing about the fact that I was fired from corporate media and he was fired from corporate media for essentially challenging some of their narratives. And he said, it's funny because the last time that McGregor was on Fox News was when I had him on. And as soon as they fired me, he hasn't been invited back before again. So I'm not sure if they were actually firing Tucker or firing McGregor. But that's kind of the way they control things, coming back to the beginning.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. It's and also it's great to see you again. And I hope this is the final stages of this war.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Glenn. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I think you do a delightful job. Enjoy your podcast and your thoughts and your friendship. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks.